WestBam is funny. It's really a name that developed. The vision of our nakedness and our wastedness, will once again be understood by future generations, and they will hold us as icons. But clear from my name, I would never have a career in the West, but rather in the East. I did all fighting sports. I did Aikido, Taekwondo, and boxing. Being inspired to open yourself up to new ideas, and also that hippie-ish kind of belief you can change the world. Oi, oi, oi. You want to keep the world out. It kind of was a little bit, again, like the old West Berlin.
WestBam, Maximilian Lentz. Max, hello. As you know, I'm Steve Blame, or Stephen James, or Steve. So there are 6 of us on this little Zoom call, which is good. Now, we know each other a bit. And during my MTV days, we had the occasional meet where I would interview you, and then we would go out. And I can remember about 3 nights of total excess. And I promised myself, well, actually, I promised myself that I might talk about them later, especially the one in Berlin. But you probably don't even remember
wonderful. That was beautiful.
Okay.
Unforgettable night, man.
Unforgettable. Oh, my God. Well, I don't know. It was it took me a while to get over it, that's for sure. But firstly, I wanted to talk about, I mean, this is really going back early into your childhood. Because if I think about my childhood, I had extremely, in some ways, conventional parents in a dysfunctional family, but I was very conventionally brought up. And you were, in a way, in a very opposite type family, in a very unconventional family. Can you tell me what your parents were like and what it was like being a child of that type of parent?
Well, there's this special German thing, like I think that all that hippie thing in the 60s, when I was a small kid, at the end of the 60s, early 70s, all all these stories about the 68ers, they call them in German, 68er. And they were like, since their parents were like the people of the war and the Nazi times, they were convinced they had to build a different future. And ever since the Nazi regime was so about authoritarian stuff, they decided they had to go the exact opposite way, anti-authoritarian, which in a way is kind of a, and that's what I say about this whole generation. It's kind of an extremist thing, and the opposite to, from my view today, of the opposite of Nazism would be anti-extremism. But it was kind of extreme. So you give you a little example. You were like invited to, because like young boys, if they are allowed to do anything, what we would enjoy doing was like start fires in the house, in the bathroom, in the bathtub. We would put all the papers in there and light a fire, because that was really fun, Or even, to some extent, I remember there were like weird stories. We were like throwing with cats and stuff and catching them and stuff like that. And from my view of today, I'd say you tell a child, don't do that. That animal is panicking, don't do it, it's torture, But ever since we were supposed to be really free and not have these authoritarian kind of what's Befehl? Right. So since we weren't supposed to have any rules, it kind of like, for me, the biggest culture shock was when I came to school and suddenly there was rules. And, when I was 6 years old and I was this hippie child and I came into school and they said, sit down now, do this, do that.
So when you say hippie, you know, what comes into my head is, it's a cliche, but what comes into my head is, you know, sex or free love and, you know, smoking dope and just being free with everything, basically. Was that part of it as well? That were they?
Well, the kids weren't like part of that. In those days, I know other stories, you know, where, you know, that even haunts the Greens in Germany, that they had like hippie-ish kind of people that would say, well, if the child has a sexuality and, you know, it wouldn't go into that with us. But, you know, like they were like, also that was kind of a part of that hippie-ish thing, you know. By the way, my mother hates it when I say we were hippies, because now she's old, she's over 80 years old, and now she talks about hippies the way the old Nazis would talk about hippies, you know, these dirty, lazy people, you know. Now, you know, like all the old hippies kind of don't want to be called old hippies, at least my mother, you know, and now she doesn't like it. But so from my mother's point of view, she wasn't a hippie at all. No.
You were brought up, it was a very culture.
Happened to have long hair, and we were supposed to do anything. And, you know, there was a lot of us living together, and we had, you know, these kind of paisley shirts, but we weren't hippies.
You were brought up in a sort of very culturally, I would call it in a sense, privileged background. I mean that in a positive way, because your mother was an artist, or still is an artist. Your father was a professor at the university. So there are intellectuals and also culturally aware. How did that initially rub off on you? What was the surroundings, the sort of cultural surroundings that you had?
Actually, that's the best part of my my education, so to say, if anti-authoritarian can be education at all. But being inspired to open yourself up to new ideas, and also that hippie-ish kind of belief you can change the world and do something and ignore all the old world and all the old rules and all the old stuff and come up with something revolutionary, you know. And that kind of like stuck with me when I was, you know, a teenager. I then logically turned into a punk rocker, you know, because that was the next kind of development of like, we are so free, we are even against hippies, you know. And for me, punk rock was the next kind of like musical revolution. And here's an example. I had this concept of freedom in my mind that fitted kind of to the punk concept, that you don't have to learn to play an instrument, you know, kind of. And that's with me until today. I admire musicians that play Wagner in an orchestra, and, you know, and they rehearse for like 5 hours a day. But personally, I've never rehearsed. I like to do things as I have the idea, and I don't like the praxis idea, but I like the conceptual idea, the idea you can make something up and revolutionize anything, you know. And kind
if
of
they
like,
have expectations of you, because if they, you know, you're saying they're hippies, and I know that this sort of feeling is they're letting you find your way, in a sense. That's what you're giving. But they must have had some expectations of you. And when you talk about when you're young and you set fire to things in the bathroom, you're obviously trying to get a reaction out of them. Was there anything that you did that got a reaction out of them?
I only remember one time, like when we had like kind of a discussion. Then we were like around 11 years old, and then we kind of destroyed a cupboard or something, you know, to see whether that works out. And then I know my mother burst into tears for one time, because she, you know, she couldn't be, you know, that whole special, I guess, with boys, destruction and this anger energy is something really that comes natural, and that's anti-hippie-ish, you know. So the hippies had the belief well, it's all education. You know, these Nazi generation people have been miseducated, you know? And if you educate a boy to play with puppets and maybe even the girl to play with guns just to turn it around, that will work. But I don't think from nowadays from knowledge, I wouldn't agree, because they then later found out that even with primates, you know, if you give like a primate kid, a male one, to choose between a gun and a puppet, he goes for the gun. And the primate girl goes for the puppet, you know? So that seems to be quite even beyond being a, you know, that's a mammal, you know? And that seems to be kind of very much engraved into the DNA. Aggression, that's what I believe is, especially of the boys, obviously also the girls, is a part of that, you know? So,
but you went for the boxing gloves, didn't you?
The will to dominate, you know?
But you went for the boxing gloves, didn't you? You actually, didn't you become a... Sure. Started boxing.
I was like, I did all fighting sports. I did Aikido, Taekwondo, and boxing. In the end, boxing was the roughest, you know.
Yeah, but they must have wondered why you were training. You know, why were you doing boxing?
Yeah, that's exactly what my mother said. She said, "Well, you know, I never hit you, and all you do is go join a boxing club." You know, that was. She was kind of smiling, but kind of, well, what a weird world, you know? So you don't want your kids to be ever, you know, brutalized or anything done to them, and you held yourself back even in the moments of biggest frustration or provocation by the kids, you know? But that one thing I remember when I had kids, you know, because my mother would always kind of like make it into a sacrifice that she, although she was beaten as a kid, she wouldn't beat her kids. Now, obviously, I wasn't beaten as a kid, but I never felt it was a sacrifice that I didn't hit my kids, you know. I never did, and I didn't feel they could be thankful for it or anything like that, you know. So
thank God we've got that out of the way, because that could have been a difficult one. So listen, what was the music that they listened to at home?
Well, you know, like I remember like really different things. Obviously, one thing that has like quite an influence on me was like Rolling Stones, my father, and the loudness, you know, when you're a kid, it hurts your ears. I was quite shocked, you know. In those days, kids would go in cars, you know, they wouldn't get beaten and we would be hippies, but they wouldn't drive with a safety belt. Parents would smoke in their car, you know, and all of that. So, parents would listen to music very loud or make kids stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning or stuff like that. So, which kind of like that makes up for the not getting beat up, you know. But Rolling Stones. From the 60s, I seem to remember, like, I can only tell about the things that had an influence on me. I remember, like, because probably they listened to more, you know. But what stuck in my head was this weird, like, Brazilian song, the super soft one, you know, the girl from
Ipanema. Yeah.
It's kind of like weird, kind of making, you know, like even made me afraid, you know, kind of like, it felt scary to me, you know. Some disco songs felt scary to me. Do the Hustle, you know. I remember, and that wasn't like a favorite of my parents, but I remember like sitting in the back of the car of my aunt, and in the radio they were playing "Do the Hustler," very kind of like, I guess, positive song. It got me so scared and so much aware that one day I had to die, you know, as a kid. I don't know why. So music always had a very strong influence on me, and in some surprising ways.
Your father knew Joseph Beuys, didn't he? and he came round.
Yeah. That's quite a thing that my parents met at the Art Academy of Düsseldorf, which at the time was probably the most influential in all of the world. And they were co-students in one class with Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polke, were like some of the most important artists of the times to come. And Joseph Beuys, I don't know, I might have met him as a kid even. My father always said, well, later when Beuys was so famous, well, when Beuys was talking to me, he always made so many drawings, and I wish I kept all these drawings, But so all he was left with was a little drawing with saying to Otto, that's my father, Joseph, and blah blah blah. So, and we found a drawing of Sigmar Polke in one of the old cupboards, So anyway, but for example, Beuys, I realized at the time he seemed like a weirdo to me, but he's even talked with a very similar accent to my father, this Rhinelandish kind of accent. And today, I'd say, yeah, Joseph Beuys is one of these, what can you expect of an artist? Today, I go on the motorway and I see a lot of stones by the side, and I think, yeah, that's art, it's beautiful. And that way to look at the world, to me, through my father, comes from Joseph Beuys, so like the whole idea, that's for me, one of the central points I'd say in my life is the Beuys defined art as changing something. So any type of change. So if you make yourself a cup of tea, you change a little bit. So that's art, kind of like if you make yourself a dinner and you, how do you say it? You
stir
it.
Yes.
And ever since all these weird days, I haven't practiced my English enough. Anyway, you stir up your chocolate. It's art. You're an artist. Everybody is an artist. That's such a beautiful, and seriously, if I if I scramble my eggs and I put them on a plate, I say how beautiful. So all that background is really with me. It's true. So in that way, I've got things to criticize like everybody about the parents and what mistakes they made, like educating you. But in a lot of ways, I feel I'm quite a child of my parents. That's true.
You also had a mentor and someone that was really stayed with you, most of your life, and I presume he was connected to the family, William Rutger.
William, yeah.
And what was his relationship to the family? Was he a family friend or was he an actual relation?
Yeah. Well, he came into the family through my father. He was an assistant to my father at Art Academy in PH in Münster. And later he became the spouse of my mother, and they even married later on. So, and with me, he always seemed to have, like, that's my impression. I might be completely wrong, when I say it, but like, I always get the feeling from my parents that I was like the golden boy. This might be completely wrong, Maybe they thought nothing like that, or they thought my small brother was the golden boy, or my small sister, or whatever, or my big sister. But so there was 4 of us. So, but that was the vibe I got from them, and kind of this was quite taken on by William. William kind of like discovered me as a special person, but it wasn't quite clear what my speciality would be, So like, but he took me on the road. So in the early 80s, when I was a teenager, he was quite into all that political fight against, what eventually became the Greens, against nuclear energy, Gorleben and stuff. And also kind of like, legalize it, obviously. And then with some sympathy, even like for like the fight against the state, the Baader-Meinhof group, some sympathy for that. So in the early 80s, he would take me to the earliest alternative press in Frankfurt. They were like, what eventually became the Taz in Germany, came from the alternative press, a product of the 70s, early 80s. So I was drawing political little things against atomic energy and stuff, and I even did a book at the time, and then already with my drawings about school, that I hated school, it was called Schulhorror, school horror, and that had all my little drawings about school, about my hate of school. So typical anti-authoritarian. So, and at the time, William was already my manager. So, and then when I was 17, I was William was living in Berlin, and I joined him because anti-authoritarian. I didn't want to join the German army, and in West Berlin, you didn't have to go. In those days, the nightlife, like ever since I was 15, with the new wave clubs and even tramping to, hitchhiking to Berlin, nightlife was a big thing for me. And kind of like then William introduced me to some clubs, and kind of like that's when I got the idea, DJing, that's a fascinating job,
Yeah, just to go back from that, because you talked about punk earlier, and you were a punk in Münster before you went to Berlin. And you were probably one of the first punks in Münster, weren't you? So it must have been, wasn't it quite a difficult thing to be? To be honest, I can tell you a story about me, that in, I think the year that Elvis died, was it 76 in the summer or 77? I 77, I think. I worked in a factory in the summer, and it was full of teddy boys. And there was me and this guy who was completely a punk, and me who loved punk music. And when Elvis died, we laughed, and they beat us all up.
So, well, similar, but because I'm, Münster is in the heart of the British sector of West Germany. Northern Westphalia was even like a British invention, after the Second World War. And that's another major influence. I mean, growing up as a kid in Münster, you're like musically socialized by John Peel from BFBS, and kind of like also the soldier people that were like hanging out in most bars, and kind of a rough neighborhood to grow up in, So by the same time, that punk influence was obviously a English influence. By the same time, you had the worst enemies of punks in your neighborhood, British soldiers, and they would always like, we're gonna fucking kill you because why, you're a fucking punk. It was all like that. I have some experiences like that, and they say like, okay, the Specials, Madness. These were like ska groups of more like skinhead kind of people, but we also listened to that. They said, name me 10 songs now. So back in those days, I mean, what I take from those years is like the importance of music, that, like if you listen to the wrong type of music and therefore have the wrong type of haircut, you might get killed for it, That underlines the big role that music in those days played. It does, I think, in youth culture, it always does to some extent, but I feel that's one thing that has changed over the decades, Today, people have more things to identify with. Back in those days, music was played a major role, you know.
I mean, I would say it's more homogenized today, and then back then there were more different types of styles, but you only belonged to one groove in a sense at a time. Do you know what I mean? It was like the 70s had some great, you know, I mean, there was an amazing variety of music back in the 70s from, you know, from all sorts of music, but you tended towards one thing and then moved on to the next thing. And as you said, you were a punk back then, but you were also in bands, weren't you? You were active and playing. And weren't you a drummer?
And I was everything, you know. I was nothing and everything. So because, you know, as I say, you wouldn't rehearse. So it's hard to say somebody who doesn't rehearse to play the bass is a bassist. Somebody who doesn't rehearse to play the drums, but he still does. You know, is he a drummer? You know, and William got me my first Korg synthesizer. You know, then I was 14, and so I joined that because like punk rock to me and my homies, you know, in the very beginning, it wasn't a working. You know, some people say like, why, you know, how do you come from punk rock to techno? That's completely opposite. In those days, in the early days of German new wave, Neue Deutsche Welle punk rock, you had, it was a thing introduced to German society more by intellectuals from Düsseldorf again, rather than it was a working class, you know, that British kind of like UK subs, Sham 69, if the kids are, you know, you know, oi, 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 you know, so that was kind of like, we had some sympathy for that, but we were listening to more like groups like Wire, and then a lot of like, you know, who had some like pogo hits, but by the same time were experimental, you know? And so like, for me, although looking back, I'd say I have to agree to David Bowie saying, well, punk is a great thing, but I miss the music. At the time, I wouldn't have understood what he meant, you know, but I understand now, yeah, that whole, you know, in the end, it was, you know, wow. It was rather, looking back, it was like more chanting to the 50s to some extent, the simplicity of the original, you ain't nothing but a hound dog or something, you know, like it wasn't what I felt at the time. There was a revolution in music. It wasn't exactly a musical revolution. But then again, people like Daniel Miller, you know, Fat Gadget, the early Depeche Mode, Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, these were all like fairly experimental electronic groups. And so, the step from that understanding of punk rock to dance music wasn't that far.
How old were you when you went to Berlin? This was a semester that you had free, or you took off to go to Berlin and visit William, wasn't it? And you were still at school.
No, I went to school in Berlin, and I loved it. It was. I must say, like, there was half a year, but then due to the different systems, schooling systems in Berlin and Westphalia, I would have stayed in Berlin straight, you know, but they would have made me go I would have, because of the different system, would have had to repeat a whole year. And then I decided, and, you know, and I always listen to my parents, and they said, well, everybody has to get a high school degree, you know? So, and I didn't want to do one more year. So I stayed only half a year and then finished my school in Münster, you know, and then went back to.
But what was your impression of Berlin? Because in those days, of course, this is pre-Berlin Wall coming down. And Berlin was a very different and special and unique place in the world. So could you sort of describe it to me in terms of how you felt about it as a very young man going there and seeing Berlin?
Yeah, well, that was early in when I was 15, I was in Berlin for the first time on my own with my punk rock friends. My punk rock friends were a little bit older than me. So like I was the youngest, and we went by hitchhiking, partly by train, especially through East Germany. We took the train, you know, and then we ended up in this island, this fascinating island, you know, that from the first time I went there, and I came from Bahnhof Zoo, you know, and I read Wir Kinder from Bahnhof Zoo, from Christiane F. and stuff. So that story, that city, you know, the wall city, you know, there was this famous song by Duff, Kebabträume in der Mauerstadt, which was all about Berlin, you know. So there was a place of craving and of fantasizing about it, and from the first day I was there. In those days, it was like this island that was kept by the Allies against Russia, basically, and as like a forefront to like push Western propaganda into the Eastern Bloc, you know, which I think turned out to be very useful in the end, you know. And I realized, looking back, I was a part of that, you know, and I probably did serve my country more as a DJ in West Berlin than as a Bundeswehr soldier, you know.
One thing Nick Cave said about Berlin is that he gave him the confidence to do what he wanted to do and not give a shit about what other people think.
That's, I think that is the thing that Berlin has always had and still has today. I think, and now now that I'm a little older and more wise, I'd say that story begins way before the 60s. That story begins probably with Friedrich der Große, that Prussian king, who probably was a gay guy who kind of like had this kind of also this idea, well, you know, everybody should live the way they want to. And he has this very famous quotation, jeder soll nach seiner Fasson glücklich werden. So, and that kind of like, then he had all these people that were persecuted in France, the Huguenots, these people for their religion and their beliefs. He said, well, join me here in Prussia. You can do it. And he invited Voltaire to his court. And so he was kind of like, by the same time, he founded the tradition of German militarism, which eventually led to that incredible military power that started world wars. But then again, he was in a good way the founder of this, come to Berlin and live and be happy the way you want to be happy, you know? So that's quite contradictory traditions that I think he founded.
William sort of opened doors for you, but he also clearly, you had this potential to do things and to do and to take risks and do different things, and including writing an article where you described what the future of the DJ would be and what the future of cover art as being art. Can you tell us about that?
Well, here comes another story. There was, you know, I talked about my early drawings in the political far left alternative press. One of those guys was like living in Frankfurt, a Latvian guy named Indulis Bilzens. And he was kind of like a impresario to William, and he liked William. And William brought me in. And kind of like Indulis always stuck around, and he had quite an influence as well on William and also on me. And in fact, you know, that what I'm very happy now that this manifesto at the time was released. I had written it for myself, only for myself, and I had forgotten it in William's car. Now this guy Indulis found it, and he said, wow, that sounds interesting. a DJ as the musician of the future that plays a more minimal kind of really underground music, and it will be the pop music of the future, but also the underground of the future. Mind you, like in '84, you didn't have techno or house or any of that. You had disco and you had new wave disco, but you didn't have the idea. Also, you had hip hop, but hip hop was about the rapper and stuff. But the idea that the DJ himself would become the artist, that was kind of revolutionary. To me, it came natural because, as I say, from my parents' background, whatever you do is kind of art. So for me, to see my DJing as an art form was easier than for other guys. For them, it was a job. They would talk about, I think next month this record will be big, and and I will program this, and I will, and look at the record reviews, and and talk to my boss about the next beach party and all of that crap. So in that world that I came into, the disco world, all these ideas at the time were completely new and alien. But I didn't look for anybody to release this text of mine. But Indulus found it in the car, read it, and said, "Oh wow, this is like a manifesto. And he gave it to a friend of his who had at the time an avant-garde newspaper called Der Neger, and they it was them that kind of like brought it to the public audience."
And it was also under Westphalia Bambata, wasn't it?
Yes,
so
exactly.
So this is obviously Westphalia, the part of Germany where you're from, where Münster is, and Bambata from Africa, Bambata, and this is where your name WestBam came from. But a change of name, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, my real name is Stephen James, and my stage name, which I changed to be on MTV, was Steve Blame. And I've had a ton of therapy in my life. And when I talk to therapists, they always say that when you change your name, you develop a second personality. So you have a different personality. So I have a different personality for Steve Blame, which I think is the one that gets into trouble. And we'll talk about that nightclub a bit later.
And
what happened?
Gets all the blame for it.
It gets the blame for it. Yes, exactly. And so
a good start as your psychologist.
Exactly. So who is WestBam in relation to Maximilian Lenz?
Kind of like WestBam is funny. It's really a name that developed. Kind of like when I came to Berlin, people in West Berlin, at the time, there was no Aussies around. Well, they were around, but behind the wall somewhere, hidden. So people would always blame the West Germans. So the worst word in West Berlin was Wessis, That was the bad word, because Aussies, they didn't get bothered by Aussies, but by those West German tourists. So for me, again, that's my anti-authorian thing to say, like, well, I come from Westphalia, so I put the West in my name even, That was kind of a provocation at the time. So when I started playing at the Metropole, which was the big gay club in Berlin, again, that was another big underground that you didn't have. Probably worldwide, you didn't have such a big and quite crass gay scene as that scene in Berlin at the time. When I played there, I changed my name from Westphalia Bambata to, at first I was WestBam with a B at the end, and then it changed to WestBam, and that, well, it's kind of a weird name, I guess, and I'm not even sure, I think at the time it was not clear to me, but clear from my name, I would never have a career in the West, but rather in the East, because West sounds good to the East. than to the West. Yeah. So, and it sounds, I realize like when Americans hear that name, they're like, oh, that's a weird name. They prefer somebody we call Paul van Dyk or Armin van Buuren. You know, that's names. So, so a lot of, so you kind of, when you give yourself a name, I think unconsciously you decide upon your faith to some extent, you know. And I'm not upset at all, you know, because deep in my heart, also being a historic person, I always thought I could do better in the East than in the West world, you know. And until today, I think the heart of rave music beats more in the East than in the West.
I think I want to come to one point that actually connects to that, because the 80s for me in Britain, which is very different from in Berlin, but the 80s for me in Britain were really dominated by it's unemployment, social unrest, homophobia, sexism, misogyny. It was, there was a pile of shit going on. And at the same time, there was an absolute amazing amount of great music during the early 80s. When you came to the late 80s, and then, acid house and techno and all these different, I think there's sort of lifestyle genres came into being. They changed the society, or they came at the time that society was changing. Now, you played, as you just mentioned, in the Metropole, you played in a gay club, and in part of the 80s, and I remember that in the early 80s, I felt comfortable as a gay man in gay clubs. In the late 80s, it was okay to go to, a techno house, whatever, a warehouse type event where they played that sort of music. And it was very mixed, and it was very much more of a sort of what we see today as a modern society, where we're all together and we don't just identify into our little groups. How was that in Berlin, and how did that relate to East and West?
At the time, I realized the Metropole, before I started DJing, and I was just a pupil away in the west of West Berlin, my classmates would rave about the Metropole. So the Metropole was, although it was a gay club, at the time it already had a cult following of straight people. Kind of like the gay crowd was like the host, and it was their music and their culture, but it had kind of clicked onto a weird kind of smaller crowd of suburban teenage people who kind of like this kind of larger, this posing, that gay thing, and like myself, the energy, So I think Berlin was one of the places. I remember my girlfriend at the time said to me, "Are you gay?" That was the first time I heard it in Münster. I never heard anybody talk about gay people. It was a more normal thing. Like gay people were more a part of it, and the question wasn't critical or anything. It was just for interest, I think that the divide wasn't as deep in Berlin, because Berlin, everybody should be happy the way they're happy. That was the vibe always. So the divide between gay and straight people wasn't as bad as it was in most other places, I believe. And that kind of translated into, then in the mid 80s, where this Macht der Nacht kind of, where I started playing house music. And on the record night, we had 8,000 people. West Berlin was empty. They were all in our tent, And I played this music that there wasn't a scene for house music or for techno-ish beats. But from the Metropole days, there was a school of that kind of energy, that it felt, and I always saw house techno in the high energy disco tradition, and basically that kind of like developed from especially for example in Chicago, from this black gay ghetto thing, translate into a more major crowd. And then, you know, the girls would come. And when the girls come, after the while, you know, the boys come. And so the kind of like that music in a open, and that whole culture, starting with the gay culture, it helped to change society, I believe.
You mentioned before also about changing society.
One little, I'm running out of energy. I need to get
okay,
my
power up.
When I get it.
Yep, okay. Power up.
One second.
No, I'm going to leave you running. That's what we do on this podcast. We're back on again, are we? Okay, good.
Back on, yeah.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that you mentioned earlier about the work you did in, you know, inverted commas, for the German government, for the West, in terms of, you know, bringing down the wall and bringing societies together. But it's not a joke, is it, really? It's something that really is fundamentally true, that played a role. Can you also explain what role that played and what connection did it make to the young people in the East at that time behind the Iron Curtain?
That part, you know, I always had the tendency to believe music can do something so like in a political way. And the best thing music can do is free your mind. You know, the best music frees your mind. So even in 87, you remember Gorbachev and Perestroika. Due to Indulis Bilzins, who was Latvian, at the time who was a part of the Soviet Union, we got this invitation to play in Russia, not Russia, Soviet Union. Latvia wasn't Russia, Soviet Union. So
was that in Riga?
That's a legendary gig, and we did like 2 or even 3 events at the time. And in those days, I mean, they were testing, what can we do now? Is Perestroika about opening up? And I was a little part of that in Riga, because they were like looking for their kind of freedom from, and hoping to be able to break away from Soviet Union at the time, which eventually happened. But at the time, they were still a part of it. And then again, there was a Russian group from Riga who saw me perform, from St. Petersburg. They were called Pop Mechanics. And they performed that night in Riga, and they saw me. And then we did a gig together. They asked me, and they said, yeah, that's great, scratching and, you know, mixing stuff. So I was mixing Zig Zig Sputnik into that Russian band live on stage, and so on. So that's only to say, yeah, well, kind of like that whole changing the world to me by music took place again more in the East than in the West. You know, in West Germany, West Berlin, in America, you have a lot of trends and they go by and they something, you know, but that music at that very special time, I'm not saying, you know, that brought down the wall, but did something that is over the average of what pop music usually does, you know? And to come back to Berlin, well, there were all these radio shows on Sender Freies Berlin, you know, the free, you know, the transmitting from the West right into the East, you know, and all these kids in East Berlin would listen to these shows and they would fantasize about that, you know, the little club that I took you to in '89 before the wall came down, UFO, you know, which happened, as you might remember, to be quite empty at the time, you know, but for the East German kids, that was a place that they would dream to one day, maybe, but they wouldn't even hope to dream they could join that and, you know, dance to acid music and be really crazy and free, whereas they live under this oppressive system that holds them down and keeps them away from it. But so like that kind of like craving for it, that was the root was planted with the music, with the radio shows, obviously. And well, and the proof of what I say is that after the coming weekends, after the wall came down, the UFO suddenly burst, was bursting with people. It was like overcrowded, Before in 89, there had been Acid in 88 that had been on the cover of Bravo, and it was like kind of like a major kind of pop trend, even in Germany, in England, even more. But kind of there was in West Berlin, there was going down, was on the way out, because there was not real use for it, and it was just, yeah, you could dance to that, but we could listen to Minnesota funk and dance to Prince. Wouldn't that be a good idea now, And it was only for those East German kids that suddenly overcrowded the UFO, that kind of techno culture in Berlin developed a whole new logic, because at that point, it was not just a fad from last year that was on the way out. Now it's a point of craving and of fantasizing and of this new music that's so much different from anything in East Germany, that's not about songs, that's not state control, that's not not even the East German protest songs with the old guitar going blah blah blah. It was just the future. It was electronic. It was super Western, and kind of that. All these dreams and hopes of these kids, as I've said a million times, but still true. All these hopes and these dreams. And these like almost like children that a door is open and there's like this magic wonderland behind it, and now it's all open up and the game starts all over, and everywhere it's glittering and it's freedom and it's future and it's love, peace, and it's progress, and it's democracy, and it's liberalism, and it's no state control no more. Kind of the music got loaded with that.
There was this very anti the East feeling when people saw the people from the East come over in what they were wearing, with these washed out denims, and how they were with their horrendous 70s haircuts and God knows what. But the point of contact between the two people, as it were, of the two peoples between East and West, was in these clubs, wasn't it? This was the point of contact. This is where they actually did mix, and where there was some relation started between East and West. And I think that was massively important.
I agree to that 100%. And even it was a nice mix, because like kind of that music and most of the DJs at the time came from West Berlin, but the energy, the people came from East Berlin. It was in their locations, Haus der jungen Talente, and what they always say, warehouses, empty ones in East Berlin. That's one thing I hate about like the West, the Western look at the techno revolution. They always say, well, they had these empty houses in East Berlin, as if it was about empty houses, It was full houses, and these kids were the East Berlin kids, and it kind of, I learned from that, because I saw this new kind of energy, and kind of like, because this was what I was all about all the time, kind of like free your mind, take the music, and do something wild, revolutionize it, make it more crazy, take the energy, take it over the top. And kind of like, I had a little, like Berlin was, also West Berlin was one of the best places for it, but it wasn't until the wall came down where it was taken to a whole new level. And this is about the people of East Berlin rather than about the empty houses of East Berlin, Because, mind you, there were lots of empty houses in West Berlin as well, because West Berlin, didn't have any jobs. That's kind of like what made West Berlin fun, It would only attract more or less useless people like myself, all these gay people and people who didn't want to go to the army. Whereas when you're a West Berliner, you would go to West Germany to be a dentist or whatever, so all the reasonable people left and all the scum like myself would go there, So, so kind of like that kind of, and okay, these people who were there kind of were like very arrogant. So like, as I say, when the war was up, the bad word was Westies from West Germany. Now, when the wall came down, you had a whole, for the West Berliner, you had a whole new tribe of bad people. That was the East Aussies, So, but I wouldn't take that personally against the Aussies, because the West Berliners hated the Westies as well, So that's a little bit like English mentality, Don't worry about it. Yes, of course we hate you, but we hate anybody anyway, Never mind, we hate, never mind, we hate Germans, we hate the French, and we hate the Italians, and we hate the Spanish too, So.
There's a complete different mentality today about going to a club and listening to music and going to see a DJ. Can you tell me what the difference is?
I guess there's a million differences, and kind of obviously nothing is, everything becomes, So like it's hard to say, and even for me, to even judge, There's a couple of things that I would say. Well, kind of now it's changing, but for example, in the after the 90s, how do you call this? I call it the zeros, the
noughties,
2000, the noughties, the zeros between 2001 and or 2001 and 2009. That era, sorry, people kind of like turned, because these were the minimal days when and people sobered up, and kind of, even from the East German kids, kind of like the illusion of that complete wonder world, the glittering where everybody's free and happy, and the drugs and the dancing and the raving society and the place behind the rainbow or whatever, all of that kind of like had shown that the world wouldn't change completely, but the same problems are still there and stuff. And people were kind of like frustrated, and especially when that 9/11 thing happened, the whole mentality changed, and with that came, the beginning of the Berghain era and all that kind of like, now we don't want to go naked on the love parade, and like Motta said, we are going to be one mankind, because everybody's going to be here at the love parade, and we're all going to get naked and dance to techno music and be happy about the future. Suddenly you had these people saying, oh, not everybody in the world loves us. Not everybody wants to be progressive. Liberalism might be a good thing for us, but other people would rather hide their women and dress up to the eyes, And from that very same kind of mindset came a club like the club scene in that era, that kind of suddenly was not about, we're inviting everybody and we have this great rave signal to unify us behind this idea. But suddenly it was like, we want to keep the word out. It kind of was a little bit again like the old West Berlin, who wanted to be a little world and not be bothered by the problems, and not be bothered by Aussies or Westies or by tourists who just want to be there among themselves and be quiet, and not even promote West Berlin, because you wouldn't want anybody to come anyway. So it's kind of like that became the vibe in that decade to come, and kind of like people, sobered up in a lot of ways. And I realized, in that today's has changed again, but in that decade, people like us were like very much the the has-beens that would get, that would like go out and get drunk, or, and people, on social network, you read, oh, he had like 3 drinks at his DJ table. What kind of working ethos is that, It really, serious. I couldn't believe it. I said like, this kind of like, we want to keep a good crowd. We want to be among ourselves. We want a DJ to do a proper job, and so on. That was kind of like, okay, Berghain was different. Berghain kind of still was the flag of, we want to get naked. But a lot of the techno culture in other ways were like more this kind of, ideals that, for example, Paul van Dyk lived up to, kind of like techno is a clean thing, and you are politically correct, and you want to do a positive music, and you dress up in fashionable stuff, and you go to a party and listen to a DJ, and you make yourself reasonable ideas about the future and plans, and you be that type of like straight up person, and kind of like over the last kind of years, and especially now, after the Corona times, I'm hesitant now to say, but because we're still in the Corona times. But when clubs kind of like first open up again, I felt this energy, and it made me, for example, play a lot harder, because again, I realized, wow, this is cool. The kids want something more energetic and harder again, because of all the pressure and all the energy that's gotten held down for such a long time now, and that the logic for this new type of energy kicks in. And I hope the next couple of years, now I'll make a prediction again, this kind of new energetic and more, again, social, and open up and meet everybody and be open to a lot of new beats and new people, that I think, and I hope, but once we get over that Corona thing, which I hope in one way or another we will at some point, that would be my dream, but also my prediction for the next 10 years,
Well, I think for one, I'd look forward to a change in terms of the energy and the creation.
When you have a long career, you always go through phases, then, and there was, as I say, there was the times when we were suddenly the has-beens, because we would get naked. But, hopefully in the future, the vision of our nakedness and our wastedness, will once again be understood by future generations, and they will hold us as icons of that, way of life, get naked and free your mind, and your ass will follow, and free your ass and your mind will follow.
Well, I don't know about getting naked, but I definitely agree about freeing your mind and your ass will follow. So. Anyhow, WestBam, Max.
In our age, we don't have to get that undressed no more. I agree to that, But I like to inspire other people that are kind of younger to get undressed and dance on the table.
Okay, Max, listen. It was great to see you again. It's great to see you looking so good and so fit, and especially,
low carb diet, man.
Oh, is it? Well, I think I need one.
Back in the days, it was drugs. Now it's low carb. Back in the days, it was groupies, and now it's securities.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews, and here is where you can connect.